also to see wide interest from the audience in this topic. Before anything, I would like just to inform you that this event is being recorded, and then the audience is welcome to submit any questions they may have for our panelists in the Q&A function. As you may have guessed, this weird title comes from one of our panelists, Janelle book and blog on AR weirdness. Hello, Janelle. In these, Janelle shares her unique and funny experiments with machine learning algorithms to explain how AI works in an understandable, relatable way. And actually, it was her who inspired me to organize this event. It was her work, her book that inspired me. What algorithms can and cannot achieve is important to have in mind when we are approaching how to regulate AI and to understand how AI works and what it's actually capable of. We always mention in Brussels how Europe is behind the US and China in the race for AI development and how we must become more competitive. While Europe is strong in research, we fall behind in other areas. We therefore need to get our approach and our rules right, and for this we need to understand the limitations and capabilities of these technologies. We need to understand what the real risks are based on the current realities, not on ideas from science fiction. I still remember the first report we adopted in the European Parliament in 2017 on civil rules and robotics, which seemed to be influenced more by science fiction novels than the real world. To this day, still, this report was one of the files I worked on that drew the most attention from the press and from the public, I have to say. Of course, sensationalist approaches as such draw interest and attention from the media, from the public, but it also triggers unnecessary fears and distrust in technologies that are already helping us to improve our lives and which offer so much more potential. Just think of the current pandemic. AI has helped a lot in understanding the development of the virus, in the preparatory work for vaccines, and even detect asymmetric cases. So while apocalyptic narratives that AI could destroy us are far from reality, at the same time, we cannot ignore that there are still safety concerns and real risks that AI could undermine fundamental rights. Over the past years, we have seen a surge in debates around AI ethics, on the role of black boxes and algorithm fairness, etc. Reports from China of facial recognition being used for mass surveillance of citizens brought biometric recognition into the limelight, with many urging cautious and for outright bans in public spaces. But recent jihadist attacks in Europe have also triggered many to call for the deployment of these technologies in the fight against terrorism. One of the biggest dangers I see is not that the EU will allow killer robots or install a social credit system. I also don't think that we need to fear the overthrow of the human race or being subjected to robot overlords, at least not anytime soon. No, my concern is that, driven by fears and guided by what ifs, instead of reality, that we will end up over-regulating AI technologies and kill innovation in Europe. We are in a position where we can still set the global standards, but we need to act now. For this, we should look beyond our EU framework and explore partnership opportunities with the US on AI. While we differ in our approach, there is transatlantic alignment when it comes to ethics. The EU and the US make up more than 50% of the world economy, which makes it much harder for challengers to ignore if we work together. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's a privilege to have such a rich panel of experts with us today to discuss these and many other issues of the AI. As you know, the Commission is coming out with actual rules soon. So I hope that this debate will help shed some light on what areas we should be focusing on when it comes to regulating high-risk AI and where not, to help steer us on the best path. So without further ado, I will give the floor to the Commissioner for Internal Market, Mr. Thierry Breton, to discuss what the Commission is planning for the upcoming framework. So Thierry, the floor is yours. You need to unmute your microphone.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dita, and thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, to organize this extremely interesting webinar in these circumstances and the way we have to do it, of course. And I have to admit, today is the first time in my life that I'm participating at an event that has weird in its title. Usually the titles are much more technocratic, but honestly, I really think it's a good idea. By the way, it's also the first time in my life that I'm participating to a webinar that I saw on the screen on one side a cat and on the other side a fish. But the good thing is that they were not in the same box. So, and by the way, the cat was beautiful. This being said, this is of course the magic of participating this way all together. So of course, let's come back to our subject, which is extremely important. Today, artificial intelligence may look like a special weird technology. Tomorrow, it will be, I believe, a perfectly normal part of our life. So when we make rules for AI, we have to design them for a world where AI is omnipresent, where citizens encounter AI at every turn in their life. And for that to happen, we need to build trust among citizens in AI the way they trust, for example, electricity. So how do we get there? That's really the question we should raise, and we raised ourselves at the Commission. Well, how was trust built in the past? Perhaps the most famous example was when in 1853, Elisha Otis took an axe to cut an elevator cable in front of a huge audience in New York. The elevator did not fall to the ground and crashed there. Nothing happened, which proves to the public that they need not fear elevators. In today's terms, the technology was trustworthy. As a result, skyscrapers has been built ever since. What can we learn from that example? Firstly, and probably most importantly, you have to have people to invest in the new technologies and take the risk to develop and market new services. Secondly, you have to make sure that the product is indeed safe and trustworthy. This will, of course, require additional investment and, of course, innovation. Thirdly, it has to be verified and shown to the public that they can trust the product. Now, where do we stand on these three factors within Europe? Well, Europe still has a strong position in AI excellence in research, but we do need to increase our efforts to remain at the cutting edge of industrial developments in AI. Otherwise, the equivalent of AI elevator will be built only in Asia. And to succeed, we have to leverage our strengths. Europe has a wealth of industrial data that gives us an important comparative advantage if we know how to use it wisely. Let's admit it, Europe missed the boat on the first wave of personal data. We cannot afford to make the same mistake again with the second, bigger wave, much bigger wave of industrial data. It is absolutely necessary to have a true single market for data, and that European data, especially industrial data, can be stored and processed in Europe accordingly to our rules. And I say our rules. That's why we are finalizing, as you know very well, my dear Dita, a legal proposal on data, and we are very active in supporting a European cloud infrastructure, high performance computing, and ultra-fast and low energy consumption microprocessors. If we succeed in making sure that our companies have access to European data and to the flow of the European data, it will give them a much needed boost in stimulating developments in AI that are made in Europe and respectful of our values, such as, of course, privacy, safety, and other fundamental rights. It will also allow us to become more autonomous in AI and all related technologies. If we have excellence and autonomy, we'll be able to take full advantage of the potential of the new technologies, the so-called data economy. And this potential is absolutely enormous. The value of the data economy in the EU in 2018 was above 300 billion, and it is expected to grow almost 3 times above 830 billion by 2025. That's why we have a strong focus on improving the competitive conditions of European industry. We have that, by the way, in the white paper. We have it in the data strategy, and we are mainstreaming it into all our policy actions. We now have an additional opportunity to bring these ambitions into reality, thanks to the Recovery and Resilience Facility. I just would like to remind you that 20% of the fund will be invested only in digital. That's roughly something like 150 billion euros. So that's a lot of money. But as we have seen, it is of course not enough to build elevators. If I want to take again this image, they have to be safe too. That's why, in parallel with the ecosystem of excellence, we also need an ecosystem of trust, which is extremely important for our European fellow citizens. And if there are stories of self-driving car accidents or breaches of our fundamental rights, for example, in the case of profiling without consent, they will, of course, undermine trust. For this reason, we need to take measures to prevent all these harmful experiences, at least for AI applications that really present a high risk. We set them out in the white paper back in February, and we received an enormous number of comments, including many, by the way, from outside of the EU. Most respondents felt that existing legislation has some gaps, or that new legislation is needed on specific use cases, such as biometric remote identification. The majority of respondents support some kind of restriction. However, in doing so, we must not throw out the baby with the bathwater. For AI applications without any unusual risk, in addition to complying with consumer legislation and the rest of the acquis, there should only be limited transparency obligations. Citizens should know when they are talking to a machine. And for AI applications that carry a high risk, there will be essential requirements, for example, with regards to the training data, record keeping, and human oversight. Certainly, the measures we take will have to be proportionate to the risk. Otherwise, we risk stifling innovation in Europe. And of course, we really want to avoid that. We also need to make sure that our rules are future-proof. We don't know what the next technology will be, but when it comes, our framework must be flexible enough to accommodate. And finally, people need to know that our requirements are actually respected. Hence, we need to have mechanisms of enforcement that allow us to be certain. Obviously, our rules will apply to all AI systems sold or used in Europe, whether they originate from Europe or from elsewhere. Promoting innovation, investment, and trust is not enough if the benefits will be felt only in a few places in Europe, and this is absolutely not our European way. Yet today, there are plenty of companies in Europe that could profitably use AI, but lack the capacity to take the first step. That is why we are devoting so much attention to our digital innovation hubs. In other words, technology transfer centers where companies can get practical support that they need. They have proven successful so far, and we intend to scale them up under the new Digital Europe program. If every potential innovator has access to this kind of service in her vicinity, Europe as a whole will benefit. AI will spread rapidly throughout the continent, and all European citizens will benefit. Whatever we do, future generations will look at us as we look today as the spectators back in 1853, slightly bemused by our fearfulness. But whether we will be remembered for overcoming this fear, making Europe a hub of artificial intelligence and a leading example of trustworthiness is entirely up to us. So let's rise to the challenge together and be certain that the Commission will be behind you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thierry, for your ambitious plan. You can definitely count on the support of the European Parliament. I know that you have to leave us now because your time is very limited. But for all those in the audience who would like to ask a question to the Commission, I'm happy to announce that Mrs. Lucilla Sioli, Director for Digital Industry with the Directorate-General Connect, has kindly agreed to step in for Commissioner Breton in Q&A session. Thank you very much, Thierry, again, and I'm sure we will come back to the topic very soon also in the European Parliament. So now joining us all the way from Boulder, California, Colorado, sorry, it's my pleasure to present Janelle Shane. She has a PhD in electrical engineering and photonics from University of California. Janelle is an optics research scientist, AI researcher, writer, whose writings, as I mentioned, focus on AI weirdness. Janelle, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It is wonderful to be here. I'm very honored that this event is happening, And I'm looking forward to, talking to you about the weird part about AI. And that really ties into what is the problem that we are trying to address here when we talk about whether or not to trust AI. So we will get to I have a few things to show you, and the first thing is this fish. So this is a kind of fish called a tench, and it's a big fish. And researchers at the University of Tübingen in Germany, they trained an image recognition AI on a bunch of objects, including this fish, and it was doing pretty well. But then they asked it to highlight the part of the image that it was using in order to recognize the tench. And this is what they found out that it was looking for. So human fingers against a green background, like why would it be looking for that if it's supposed to be identifying a fish? Well, it turns out that the tench is a trophy fish. And so in the images that they had trained on, the fish tended to look like this. And the AI doesn't know what a fish is and found that it could solve the problem more easily by looking for human fingers. Similarly, there's a famous example of a group at Stanford that was trying to train an algorithm to identify tumors in pictures. But unfortunately, it turns out that some of the tumors in their training data had been photographed with rulers for scale. So the AI learned to detect the rulers. And this kind of thing happens. You get these AI systems that can look at first like they're working well, but then it turns out actually there are some problems. So I wrote a book to explain how this happens and how, something that appears so smart and works on so many different problems is actually really limited and needs a lot of human help. And kind of how the AI that we are dealing with today is not the human-like AI from science fiction, but is narrow artificial intelligence. And then understanding the problem that we're actually trying to get the AI to solve. Like that is a really broad problem that's too broad for today's narrow AI. So I'd like to talk about three major things that AI does that can lead to trouble. And these are all interconnected. They all stem from AI taking the easiest route to solving the problem, which is not necessarily the best route to solving the problem. And this can show up in a number of different ways. So Inverness's AI-operated camera seemed to be good at first at tracking the football until it was in a situation where there was a linesman with a bald white head and it decided to track that instead. So this kind of thing happens all the time where you have algorithms that work really well on the test data, but then they fail in some way when they get to the real world. So in theory, when you're training an AI, you're supposed to be giving it the most realistic data possible. But in practice, you're training it on the data that you had available or the data that you had thought to collect. So this picture, for example, this is a typical use case for tagging an image and writing, auto-captioning an AI, and here, auto-captioning your image. And here it looks like it's doing a really good job. It's got the herd of sheep in the tags and in the caption, and it even knew which hills on the Isle of Skye were there in the background. But here's an interesting thing. Here is a version of that same image where I went in and erased every single one of those sheep by hand, and yet they are still there in the caption in the background. And so, this was curious at first, like what is going on here? Did I miss one dot somewhere, or is this like homeopathic sheep and the image is remembering somehow that sheep used to be there? Well, the answer is a bit more simple than that. So here's an image that never had sheep in it, and yet here they still are in the caption, in the tags. And what it looks like is during training, this particular AI saw a lot of pictures of Scotland and grassy landscapes with sheep in them because that's what people tended to photograph. And it didn't see very many grassy landscapes without sheep. And it got confused about what sheep actually are because of this. And it is so common for data to not represent the real world that that's how you get things like facial recognition systems that perform way worse on people with darker skin, or video interview software that doesn't work on people whose facial expressions don't match whatever was expected. Because AI, it doesn't know what's going on. It's just being rewarded for being correct in whatever the situation was during training. Another thing that AI does is shortcuts. So there was a group that trained a machine learning algorithm to sort a list of numbers, except that what they technically told it to do was to eliminate the sorting errors. And the AI figured out how to delete the list, thus resulting in 0 sorting errors and technically solving the problem. So AIs will look at all sorts of information that they're not supposed to have access to. So somebody told me an example of where they had a classifier that was very good at distinguishing problem medical cases from healthy cases by their case recordings. But when they looked more closely, they found that it wasn't even looking into the case recordings. It was just looking at the case recording length because the problem cases tended to have longer recordings. So other times the shortcut that ends up happening is less of a hack and more of us not quite understanding what we're really rewarding the AI for. So metrics may not measure what you hope they will. And for example, who has a stroke, especially in America, is not the same as who gets treated for a stroke. And so if you may end up training an algorithm that predicts that people with less access to healthcare are healthier. And by the same token, who gets arrested is not the same as who commits a crime. And so if you train your AI on just arrests, you may end up getting parole algorithms, predictive policing algorithms that penalize Black people and reinforce over-policing. And so you may ask, wait, how does the AI actually figure out, like we can see that it's copying copying bias, but how does it figure out who to discriminate against? Like, could we solve the problem by just not telling it about race and gender? Well, Amazon struggled with this recently in a resume sorting algorithm that they were developing because they had trained it on the resumes of people who they'd hired in the past. And from this, based on these resumes, the AI learned to avoid the resumes of women. And they didn't specifically tell it about the genders of the applicants, but one thing that AI is really good at is picking up on subtle correlations. So it was able to look at things like extracurriculars and the schools that people went to, like did they go to an all-women's university? Or it would even look at subtleties of word choice to try and figure out which resumes it should be avoiding. Because AI is super sneaky about using information that it's not supposed to have if that's what makes it easier to copy what the humans are doing. And especially when the problem is super hard, like sorting resumes, bias is often one of the clearest signals that it has. And so it will do things like use postal code, for example, as a proxy for race. Because remember, AI's task isn't to technically to find the best solution. It is to predict what the humans will do. And AI only knows how to predict that things will stay the same. So this year, the UK A-level exams were canceled. And so they tried to use AI to predict the exam results. But the AI had been trained on past data, and so it ended up basing each student's predicted score on how well students from their school had done in the past, on average. And so what ended up happening is students from poorer schools ended up being penalized, and there was, of course, a massive outcry against this algorithm. So how do we catch these biased algorithms before they cause problems? Well, we can't as we've seen, we can't rely on the AIs themselves to be ethical, to avoid bias, because they themselves are not smart enough to understand what the problem is. And we can't just, say we didn't tell the AI about race and gender, so it should be fine, because bias is such a strong signal that AI gets really sneaky about implementing it. And it's also tough in many cases to kind of look inside the inner workings and see problems there. A lot of times the inner workings of AIs are not things that people can really understand. It's really complicated and entangled. So what I think our main tools are going to be is independent audits. So doing systematic checks for known forms of bias, and just expecting the AI to try to implement bias whenever we're training it on human behavior. And as we're auditing the AI, we are changing the data and then retraining the AI and checking again, and not giving up until we've got something that meets our standards. And some applications we're just going to have to say no to, like gender detection, for example. You can't detect somebody's gender just by looking at them. And if you try, it will be wrong and it will be harmful. Detecting criminality. Or then there's cases like facial recognition where the abuses may outweigh the benefits. So the answer then to how much should we trust AI is not at all, because AI itself has no idea what's going on. It's up to us humans if we want to use AI to check its work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Janelle. I'm sure it triggered a lot of questions. We have around 100 participants in the audience, so I'm sure we will continue the debate after the other speakers will present their opinion. And both the commissioners and you spoke about the trust. So I'm now looking forward to hear from the industry point of view. It's my pleasure to welcome and introduce Cecilia Bonefeld-Dahl, Director-General of Digital Europe. She is member of several expert advisory and stakeholders group. Cecilia is on ENISA's Stakeholder Cybersecurity Certification Group, on NATO's High-Level Advisory Group for Emerging and Disruptive Technologies, and a board member of the Commission's Digital Skills and Jobs Coalition, as well as an expert on the High-Level Expert Group on AI. Her experience in ICT and tech issues is extensive, and I'm really looking forward to hear her views on the topic. Cecilia, over to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much, Dita, for having me here. So I will share also a little bit of insight, both on the investment side and on the innovation side, and then maybe just end up with looking at how the high-level group for artificial intelligence has addressed exactly some of the issues that we just heard about, and on bias and transparency. So I will share my screen with you. Hopefully it works. Let me know when you see my presentation. Yes, great. So, I mean, there is a little bit of joke saying that US has the money, China has the data, and Europe has the regulation. That is, of course, only partly true. But I think there is, there is something in that statement that we also need to wake up to. We actually see that Europe has much less unicorns, have much less investment in artificial intelligence than the other continents, which there is absolutely no reason for it, because we actually have a lot of good quality data, and we have a lot of different countries, meaning that the diversity of the data is also often very extensive if we actually have the data access. And if we look a little bit at the status of the industry, not only on, we all always speak about the big tech, but also a little bit of the ecosystem of growth. We see now that Europe has around 12% of the world's unicorns. Actually, without the UK, we only have 5% of the world's unicorns, meaning fast-growing, highly rated companies. And 15 of them, we believe, should at least be on artificial intelligence. And is that even enough? Artificial intelligence is basically one of the biggest driver that we have towards growth and towards innovation. And it's really, really important that we see that Europe gets a right share of the unicorns of the future, and that artificial intelligence is playing a major role on these. I can tell you two great examples. I met a company called Corti, who also won the Innovation Prize, Digital Europe Innovation Prize last year. They are doing AI on voice recognition. So an emergency call, so when people call, it can actually hear if you are having a heart attack or if it's something else, and how urgent it is actually to help that patient and get the help as early as possible, which is one of the examples that they do. I met another one, which is radiobotics. They do cancer research, and they can, with an accuracy that is nearly impossible for any doctor, tell whether a certain picture shows breast cancer at an extremely early stage. The biggest fight that they have is access to data. They are fighting house to house to get access to health data. And when they get access to one hospital, they lack access to the next hospital or to the next country. And in a certain point, they run out of money and they run out of time. And finally, I mean, at least for many of them, we see exit. So actually selling their company is the only solution. So access to data is a major driver for artificial intelligence. And I'm really thrilled to see that the data spaces, especially for health, are being discussed and is in the making. So the good news is, like Thierry Breton said, you know, that 750 billion in the recovery plan, 20% will be spent directly on digital, and the national plans are in the making. And we just published a plan called How to Spend It, a digital investment plan for Europe. And what you will find is there is 5 big areas of investment, but actually a catalog of suggested projects that can take us to the next level on the investing in digital in Europe. So very concrete projects on how to bring teachers into the digital age, or invest in AI and green transformation and healthcare. So I urge you to go and look at the internet. You can download it from our webpage for inspiration how to invest. One of the programs that we suggest is actually to give governments and private sector a contribution to make their data accessible, to make their data available in a format that can be, you know, much more easy for the SMEs to get. So we, of course, we're then on the investment side, just finalizing this. We're very happy to see also strengthening, lately even a further strengthening of the multi-annual financial framework, Horizon Europe, the Digital Europe program, of course, strong funding for AI and the ICT sector. So there is a talk behind the words. I think we have seen Ursula von der Leyen take a great leadership during the COVID crisis, but actually also just a long time before, for the last 2 years, we've been working on AI and setting the European AI principles. So 7 AI principles from the high-level group of artificial intelligence. But even more importantly, we have done an assessment list that you can find on the internet of 100 questions within these 7 areas, where any developer or user of AI can actually ask themselves the questions and see if they are, you know, have really thought through their trustworthy AI, either purchase, use, or development. So as you see here, the major factors is transparency, like we discussed before, robustness, diversity, non-discrimination, also related to the presentation just before, human oversight and agency, and societal, environmental well-being, accountability, very much linked to transparency, and privacy and data governance. The good news is, in my view, Europe is the most well-prepared continent for using AI and for developing AI. We have a very, very strong regulatory foundation. We have our fundamental rights, we have our GDPR, we have strong consumer laws, we have conformity assessments, we have very good standard system, which means that if we were looking through each area of this, I find that we are, as a baseline, very, very well covered, and it's much more about interpretation of use of existing law than it is about finding new. However, of course, we should look for high-risk areas and really define, are there gaps? And if there are gaps, we should make sure that they are covered. But it would be much more efficient for us, faster to implement, faster to understand how to use it, to make a guideline of usage of our existing framework, so it creates clarity for the SMEs on how to use it, transparency in how to use the existing framework, than it is necessarily to find a wall-to-wall new AI regulation. Also, I want to highlight that AI and data and privacy is a framework that will need to be discussed also on an international level. We have strong partners in the United States, a lot of good trades on each side of the continent, strong European companies with a good footprint in the States or other parts of the world, and vice versa. We will have to take the leadership and to have an openness towards our trading partners in a global economy. And the sooner we take this alignment task very serious in Europe, the sooner we will also see the growth and the harmonization of these frameworks across the globe. I'm very happy to see also B20, G20, a lot of discussions on AI and trustworthy AI. And I actually think that EU can play a major role in alignment on the international level. So for me, I would say it's all that very fine balance of preserving our values, knowing how to use our existing regulation, of course covering gap if there are, but also really getting to the point where we can create value, where we can create a sustainable environment of growth and innovation, and where our SMEs and our unicorns can grow because there is access to data, access to innovation. So finding that European balanced way in the middle between preserving values and creating values. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. You have touched on many issues. I have registered already some questions as a follow-up. But before that, last but not least, I would like to welcome to our panel Brent Mittelstadt. Brent is a Senior Research Fellow and British Academy Postdoctoral Fellow in Data Ethics at the Oxford Internet Institute. His research addresses the ethics of algorithms, machine learning, AI, and data analytics, big data. You are also a member of the UK National Statisticians Data Ethics Advisory Committee. So I really look forward to hearing more about your research and findings. Brent, over to you.
Great, thank you for unmuting me. That's what I was trying to figure out. So, okay, thank you so much for having me. So I want to, I suppose, follow on from some themes that have already been mentioned and just talk about two key challenges I see facing us in terms of development of the forthcoming AI regulation, but then just also more generally in the space of trustworthy AI, making AI trustworthy. And so I'm going to talk about challenges that come out of the many, many different initiatives we have, AI ethics initiatives internationally, where the idea is to define some sort of common principles or concepts that will then lead us to modifying or interpreting existing law or introducing new regulation, as we're considering doing now, or just to create guidelines for companies or for regulators, for data protection authorities to actually carry out their work and to make AI, help make AI more trustworthy and ethical. And so what you see scrolling in front of you is just an incomplete list of all the different initiatives we have across the world. Europe has been a real leader in this space in terms of developing initiatives. Of course, we have the high-level expert group, the ethics guidelines for trustworthy AI that they issued not too long ago, but there's many, many, many more initiatives. And what I want to speak to is just the challenge that we face both as a society, but also as industry and as individuals to actually figure out what the best path forward is in terms of making the technology more trustworthy and ethical. You can imagine that if you are a company and you want to adhere to the best possible ethical guidelines or the best practice to make your systems as trustworthy as possible, being faced with what used to be 84 different initiatives, but now is well over 150, and trying to figure out what they actually mean in practice, what they require of you in practice, is a very daunting challenge. And so it's in that regard that the high-level expert groups guidelines are a welcome move, in the sense of it's trying to find some sort of common ground between the many different initiatives. And tools like the assessment list are a very good first step. But we should see them as exactly that, a first step down this path, because really what's not important here are the questions you're asking. What's more important is whether they're being answered in a serious and effective way. And that's my concern. And that's really what the challenges I want to talk about are responding to, is the sort of inconsistency in how we might actually answer questions such as what is fairness, what is transparency, is a system being transparent enough, and so forth. So I want to think about how we can help people to answer these sorts of questions better, and also as people that are not developing these systems to check that they are actually ethical and trustworthy in practice. And really most of our problems in this space stem from the sorts of concepts and sorts of language we use. What I've done here is pulled out just a couple of principles from industrial initiatives that are actually very similar to the high-level expert groups, trustworthy guideline or guidelines on trustworthiness. But you'll see within the highlighted words here, we're using language like accountable, transparent, fairly. And really the problem here is that these are terms that can mean so many different things and can mean so many different contradictory things. And as a citizen, my concern would be that who is actually making the decision about what those concepts should mean in practice? Is that left entirely to developers? Is it left entirely to users? Is it left to the judiciary, to legislators? My hunch is that this is something that's left to people developing systems right now, and that's what I would like to see change more than anything else, to restore some democratic legitimacy to answering these questions in practice. So the first of the two challenges I want to discuss has to do with how we define fairness in practice. And so the problem that we're facing is that AI systems, as has been mentioned already, will be prone to bias, will be prone to making discriminatory decisions or classifications. In other words, they will learn from and reflect society for better or worse. We're using biased data to teach them because the society is biased. And ideally, we don't want the systems to just learn that bias and then reflect and exacerbate it and make things worse. The other challenge, though, is that it's not just familiar ways of discriminating. It can also be unexpected and subtle ways of discriminating. We've seen this in China, for example, with the social credit scoring system, where suddenly being classified as a video gamer can have a significant negative impact on your social credit score. That's an interesting challenge because, of course, being a video gamer is not something that would historically be protected under non-discrimination law. And so it begs the question of, If AI is helping us find new sorts of groups that we can discriminate against or just give unequal outcomes to, are we comfortable with that as long as it doesn't map onto traditionally historically protected groups or not? So this is the challenge of AI helping us to discriminate in new and unexpected ways. But really the problem that we have here is that if we're trying to make systems that are legally compliant, and we're trying to make systems that are not biased and are making fair, non-discriminatory decisions in practice, if we're following EU non-discrimination law, then the way that equality or fairness is defined in the law is extremely flexible and context sensitive. And it's based on intuition, it's based on historical lessons. And we've already seen that AI does not necessarily discriminate in ways that will make sense to us, in ways that will be intuitive or that will line up with historical lessons. But that flexibility actually presents a problem for us if we're trying to fix fairness at a technical level, because technical fixes for bias will require a static definition of equality. That's not to say that we can't have human expertise involved as well, but as far as we're trying to fix the problem of bias and fix the problem of fairness in advance, and to actually embed some notion of fairness within the system, we need some sort of static definition. We need something that's measurable that we can use in practice. And that's a problem because that doesn't line up with what the law demands. And so this leads to my concern that equality and similar concepts are being defined on a system-by-system basis by developers, by data controllers, by people and organizations that do not necessarily have the democratic legitimacy to make those sorts of decisions that would normally be made by legislators or by the judiciary. And so what's the solution to that problem? Well, the one that I would propose is that we need to think less about how we fix fairness by automating it, how we sort of automate away the problem, but rather we try to support consistent human assessment of the decisions and classifications that are made by AI systems. So we should be aiming for consistent assessment, but not interpretation of what concepts like equality actually mean. We should leave the interpretation of these concepts up to people, to the judiciary, to whomever actually has the democratic legitimacy to make those decisions. And so to do that, we can adopt a common procedural definition of equality. There's one particular one that I advocate for in a piece of work called conditional demographic disparity, where the idea is to help you as the human decision maker actually see different pieces of inequality that exist and that are exacerbated by your system that you may not otherwise notice, either because the person that it happens to does not experience it or does not raise a claim with you, or just because you're talking about very small groups. So how can we actually create tools that will help us see the sorts of inequality that is being created by AI? And to support that, we should adopt a common standard for statistical evidence of equality. We should require organizations that are using and developing AI to produce and share that evidence as a matter of course. I think this lines up nicely with the call for independent auditing of systems going forward. And really, if we think of that evidence as a common starting point for assessing the inequalities we're creating, then we can go some way to solving the problem and making sure that AI is not making society more unequal or making discrimination worse, but actually helping fix things. And if you're interested in the definition, the conditional demographic disparity, and just this topic in more detail, I would point you towards this paper. And then finally, just to finish up quickly, the second challenge we face has to do with invasive inferences. We can infer very invasive, sensitive characteristics of a person's life, of their interest, of their behaviors, from data that you produce just as a matter of course, as a matter of using your phone or online platforms as a sort of data exhaust that we all create on a day-to-day basis. And so from something as simple as a picture, we can infer lots of things. Like from this picture, we could potentially infer ethnicity. We can potentially infer the event that's going on, a wedding. We could infer gender. We could infer sexual identity, maybe even religion. And this is just a simple photo of a pair of people holding hands. Imagine what you can actually infer from all the different sorts of data that we are creating on a daily basis. So that's the problem here, is we're creating all this data. We're giving greater opportunities to draw invasive inferences about people's lives. And we don't have much control over it, both as individuals, but also as a society and as legislators. At the moment, the GDPR does very little to restrict this sort of inferential analytics where you can draw inferences from people's data and learn about them in ways that they would have not foreseen. Essentially, inferences are almost treated as an economy class of data within the law. And that's really problematic because because AI allows us to do this not only more easily, but at a scale that is really unprecedented. And so the solution there is maybe we need to think about creating, in the same way that we created a right to be forgotten in response to advances in technology, maybe we need to create a right to control how we are seen by AI, a right to control the sorts of inferences that can be drawn about us by third parties and the sorts of impact that those inferences can have on the content we're seeing, on the opportunities that are offered to us, and similar things. And again, if you're interested in that idea, it's developed in more detail in this paper, so I'd invite you to have a look at it. So thank you very much. I look forward to the panel discussion.
Thank you very much, Brent. And indeed, I'm sure you can continue more on your findings and research work. But now I would open the discussion for the questions. Both you and Janelle spoke a lot about fairness and also about bias. Maybe, Janelle, a question to you, because you said the only way to fight bias is through independent auditing. So I wonder how you think it can be done in practice, who should do such auditing, and what should they audit, in fact? Janelle.
Thank you. Well, I really appreciated Brent Mittelstadt's point that, right now we're leaving the auditing of these algorithms kind of up to the developers, and the developers, aren't trained to make these kinds of decisions, or they have conflicts of interest, and they pressure to ship a product rather than to fix it. So I really do think they should not have the sole authority, the sole mandate to make these kinds of decisions, and that we should be looking at, who do we want to empower to make these decisions? So yeah, an independent audit makes sense. And then how do you do an audit? Well, fortunately, with these kinds of systems, you can run hundreds, thousands of test decisions with changing variables. Like, you can do these experiments scientifically. In a lot of cases, you can build up statistics and say, is this statistically treating this group differently from this group? Or is this statistically performing worse on, people with darker skin? Or is this thing completely failing to deal with people who are non-neurotypical? And can we see that in the data? So I think there's a lot we can do with, when I say auditing, with doing the experiment and looking at the numbers and seeing if that reflects what we want them to reflect.
Thank you so much, and I will take a question from the participants also. I think it's more to Cecilia and maybe then to the Commission, to Lucilla. So the question is, we are going to teach AI to respect ethical standards and principles, but others, competing countries, can let AI do its work freely. So what we can do and how we can stay competitive, Cecilia.
Well, I don't think that necessarily doing the right thing is making you less competitive. I do agree that, too much extra burden on regulation can, slow us a lot down. But I think it's really, one of the first things should be to have guidelines on existing regulation, that being on a consumer law, that being on anti-discrimination law. So there is clarity, legal clarity on how to use the existing laws. That would be definitely speed us up right now, because it's We even see with GDPR, I mean, I understand it, the whole Brussels understand it, but there are still small companies that struggle a lot with the implementation of this. So the implementation of all the good regulations that we have and the clarity on that will speed us up. I don't think we shouldn't regulate just to say that it slows us down. But if we need to be sure that we do it in proportionate measures and that we identify the gaps and that we identify the areas, like, for example, HR or recruitment or surveillance, where we really think that we need to be super careful and that it poses new challenges and not really on. I mean, each time there's new technology, we have this situation, right? How do we actually use the existing law and what do we actually do? And do we need to regulate again? And as long as we do it with proportional measures, well, it's fine. I actually think for the speed and the competitiveness, we need to create much more simplicity and clarity, because I believe that all companies really want to do the right thing, but we need to tell them how.
So that was the view from industry point of view, business point of view, and then I would like to ask the same question to the Commission, Lucilla, and also there was another question on the EU roadmap towards setting up global AI development monitoring in the context of enforcing alignment of AI role functions, assurances of human agency when we approach AI. Lucilla.
Well, I agree with what Cecilia has just said, in the sense that I think we need to have a regulatory framework because we need to give legal certainty also to companies and to developers of artificial intelligence. And I agree with the idea that this framework needs to be proportionate and to be our proposal that you can find in the white paper in terms of proportionality is to focus our set of rules on high-risk applications. So it's not our idea to propose rules for all possible AI applications, but only for those that really bring about high risk from the point of view of safety and from the point of view of fundamental rights. And the proposal, as was explained also by the Commissioner earlier, is very similar also to what is mentioned by auditing. You can audit certain systems before they're put on the market, because the risk is, for example, in terms of safety. Already we do that. We do that with ex-ante conformity assessment in our safety legislation. Or for other applications, you can think of also, actually with all AI, you probably need to continue to assess ex post if the artificial intelligence is still behaving in the way that is considered acceptable. So, to strike this balance between innovation and regulation, it will be extremely important to be able to really focus on just the high-risk applications and also use standardization as a tool also to reduce cost, in particular for small, medium enterprises. And many international organizations, as well as European standardization organizations, are active on identifying transparency and different aspects of artificial intelligence. The second question, I'm not sure I have captured it because I don't hear you very well. If you could repeat it, please.
The question was about the roadmap of the European Union towards setting up global AI development monitoring.
We already have a website which is called AI Watch, which is managed by the Joint Research Center of the European Commission, which also works with the OECD, and which monitors developments in artificial intelligence in the European Union. Eurostat is going to publish its first comprehensive statistics on the use of AI already at the end of this year. Our regulatory framework will be proposed at the beginning of next year, in the first quarter, and will be complemented also by some reflections on liability probably later in the year, which are linked to a revision of existing legislation or new ideas. So the most important contribution, let's say, will come next year in terms of proposal of rules. We will then, of course, negotiate it with Council and Parliament, as we always do. And we will also have a lot of discussions at the international level. We do believe Europe can lead the international standards in this area.
Thank you, Lucia. Brent, you spoke a lot about inferences made from data. So I would like to ask you, how do you see the effort of private companies like Facebook to use online data for suicide prediction, for instance? So this is an area where humans, doctors or psychologists may have difficulty identifying that there is a risk, but technology could help add efforts. But at the same time, we have to balance the privacy issues, person's privacy with safety, where to find the right balance. So what is your view on these cases?
Yeah, that's a great question. In general, I'm very uncomfortable with Facebook doing that sort of thing. And it's not because it's an inherently damaging or wrong idea. It's more because of the governance that's in place for a platform like Facebook. Essentially, if you're free to experiment on your users and refine the system over time, it feels like you should have some sort of oversight that would, at the very least, be akin to the sort of oversight that a public health authority or a research institution would have. Research ethics review that is external and independent to the company or to the teams that would actually be undertaking that. I mean, effectively, what Facebook is doing is filling a public health role with none of the oversight or authority to do so. Again, I am very sympathetic to the idea that if this is literally the only place, or if they are the only platform in the position to carry out that sort of analysis and to potentially detect suicide or suicidal inclinations ahead of time, then there's an opportunity there. But to do it entirely in-house in the way that, at least historically, they've been doing it, I don't know if they've changed course recently, feels problematic. It's exactly the sort of inference that I'm talking about, where you can infer quite a bit about a person's life, but that doesn't mean that you're right to. It doesn't mean that you're justified in doing so, and it also doesn't mean that the inference is accurate.
Very clear answer, thank you. And I will maybe change a little bit to more optimistic topic. There is a question: how could AI technologies help to fight against COVID? Maybe Janelle and then Cecilia from the industry point of view. Janelle.
Hi, yeah. So, that question of how AI can help in the fight against COVID. I know people are trying a lot of things, and I think the approaches that are going to end up being successful are not the ones that are looking at really broad problems like fight COVID, but that really narrow down, okay, what is a piece of this puzzle that is narrow and simple enough that we can build an algorithm that can handle it? And whether, it can be something as simple, utilitarian, useful as transcribing voicemails accurately that people are leaving, at screening or contact tracing. Like, we're talking about just the really simple things that'll help humans get the job done. AI is, if you think about the kinds of applications that AI is really successful, ubiquitous at right now, there are these small, helpful things where a little bit of error is tolerable. You're working with a human, you're transcribing something, you're automating some small task. And so I really think, as unglamorous as those kinds of things sound, I really think those are going to be the biggest direct benefit that we're going to be seeing from AI in this kind of global effort.
Thank you so much. Cecilia, your views?
So, sorry, would you repeat the question again to me? I'm falling a little bit in and out here. So,
Okay, yes, definitely. How could AI technologies help the fight against COVID?
I mean, for the fight against COVID, I think that there is multiple directions to answer here. One is the recovery that I spoke about, so the financial recovery. I mean, definitely both with the increased connectivity we will also have increased cybersecurity. So even AI for detecting cybersecurity breaches is one area where, you know, resilience will increase in an online world. Then, of course, the use of AI into the scalable SMEs who are going online with services that are much more advanced and individualized than before, being competitive in that manner. And then, of course, on the health, the whole health agenda, right, which is not about financial gainings, but more about how to detect patterns of spread of the disease, but also patterns using AI for finding a vaccine. We know that the European Commission is already putting a lot of emphasis on the new health data space and how to really use health data in a totally different way than we do today for the benefit of prediction and prevention. So I think there are both the more, I would say, serious and societal benefits on the health agenda, and then, of course, on the financial recovery and the competitiveness and competitive services on businesses.
Before I give the floor to the Commission, there was another question which I think could be answered by you, Cecilia, which is, would it be useful for AI companies to appoint an ethics officer that supervises the algorithm?
Yeah, so ethics, yes, maybe. I'm not a specialist in ethics, but I do think for trustworthy AI with the 7 components that we mapped out, it makes really good sense to have somebody who's responsible on technology and technology usage. And I also believe that a lot of companies actually have that right already. In general, I mean, any kind of uses of technology, I mean, technology is just technology. So whether you are a company or you are a government, I mean, just reminding ourselves that this is not only about private uses of AI, but, you know, technology falling into the wrong hands of wrong governments is absolutely not the first time in history. So I think in general to have, you know, somebody responsible of how to use technology in companies and governments is definitely a very good idea.
And I will now ask, I will now put all questions to the Commission. If you can perhaps respond the same as Cecilia, whether you think there is a need to have an ethical officer in the companies, whether it's what is foreseen by the Commission as a suggestion or way forward. And the next question was also, what is the plan for IPR framework regarding inventions created by AI?
So on the ethical officer, yeah, I don't know if it's about ethics in general. Very certainly, you know, there should be in companies that develop artificial intelligence. It is useful to have an officer that can check and can take responsibility for the developments that have been made. And again, I'm thinking in particular in the case of high-risk applications, so that I think that would really also help companies, you know, think by themselves, and maybe, you know, one day that this will become just a simple code of conduct. Now, on the IPR, I am not able, because I'm not in charge of this particular part, I'm not really able to give you a roadmap for that. We have just finalized the study that we will publish soon, but I am not able to really give you a roadmap for that particular item. I just take the opportunity to add one element on COVID because I think it's very interesting. We just did a project of distributing and testing with hospitals an artificial intelligence application that reads CT scan images of lungs of patients with COVID. And it works very well. Radiologists are super happy because this machine allows them to make the diagnosis and the prognosis much faster than they normally would. So in a period of stress of hospitals, that's very useful. But I can tell you that when we were distributing it, our main difficulty was the trust of the administration of the hospital. So the administration of the hospital that was afraid a little bit from the point of view of privacy, a little bit from the point of view of, is this really robust? Is this really safe to use? Yeah, that was just an example of how important trust can be also in emergency situations.
Thank you very much. And now I would like to ask the same question to Janelle and Brent. I will leave apart the discussion whether we need to appoint officer in the companies to deal with ethics. But nevertheless, I think the ethical question is very important. And my question to both of you is, do you think that data ever comes without ethic consideration? Because Janelle, in your book, you use a lot of sometimes silly, funny examples, so they don't have wider implication. But what do you think from your experience? How do you think that the data ever comes without ethical consideration?
Yeah, I think I would probably have to think long and hard before I could come up with a data set that doesn't have some kind of ethical consideration behind it. Like a lot of these data sets that in computer science are considered like utilitarian, we're just going to use them to develop our algorithm. You know, there's been important work where people have gone and shown, no, actually, if you look at how this was collected, there's a skew, or this was collected from people without their consent. Or if you look in these tags that were maybe attached by people hired to tag images once upon a time, like there's some really horrible, you know, really racist stuff in the tags themselves. And this has come along for the ride in a lot of these different image sets. And then some of these image data sets then become the standards by which we're judging progress and like the benchmarks that we have to meet in computer science. So yeah, there's, you know, even these utilitarian data sets have some major ethical concerns behind them, even for scientists who are using them and not thinking about them. And that really does have profound implications. So I think it's, yeah, this is going to be an important aspect of our conversations going forward about how we develop algorithms and how we look at what might be ethical to develop.
The same question to you.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with what Janelle was saying. I like to think of data sets almost as a painting or a portrait you're doing of somebody. It's not a perfect representation of the person. It's your interpretation of it, and that carries meaning with it. So a data set's always going to be a biased, incomplete representation of whatever it is it's meant to measure. And some of those biases might just be simple, sort of uninteresting things, but some might actually carry significant ethical weight to them, like Janelle was talking about. So yeah, I don't think it's possible, at least when we're talking about data about people, I don't think it's possible to have a data set that doesn't carry some sort of ethical concerns or ethical implications with it. And I think it's also worth remembering that we don't know what data reveals about us or about the people represented in the data set until we analyze it. And so we have to not just think about the data itself, but also the analytics, what we're meant to do with it. You know, something as benign as weather data can actually literally under the law, under the GDPR, become personal data and become sensitive personal data if it's used in the right way, if it's used to make the right sort of conclusions or inferences about a person. So yeah, it's difficult to imagine that you could have a data set that was neutral. And just very quickly on the ethics officer question, I think we are seeing companies creating teams that are meant to basically organize different ethics processes within companies. And those sorts of things can be very healthy if basically that person or that team is there to facilitate other people that are, say, involved in the development of the system in thinking about ethics in their actual work. But if you have ethics as a standalone component, we've learned this from the development of software going back several decades. Ethics as a standalone component that only comes in after the product already exists just doesn't work. That's too late to actually influence the product. And so what you should watch out for is if there is just literally one ethics officer and it's basically this is the person that's responsible for the ethics of the system, I would highly doubt they have any real influence over the system. And I would doubt that they're actually in a position to change it or to meaningfully oversee it. That would be not a human in the loop, but just a human near the loop.
Interesting. Can I have just a next question to you, because I know that you deal also with the medical data ethics. So the question is, in healthcare, we said that the trust is, among others, related to accuracy of the system. Apart of ethical standards, are there any AI accuracy rules on the table?
So any AI accuracy rules?
Yes.
Oh, I wonder. I don't know if Janelle, if she might have a better answer to that. I'm not.
Yeah. If you're talking about something that's being approved for use as part of a medical device, if you look at something like the US FDA, it does have accuracy rules in terms of that you have to show that this thing works, and they have a procedure for that. But then going back to what Brent said earlier about you get some of these companies that are acting as unregulated healthcare providers, like, back to that question about Facebook analyzing user data to figure out who's having medical or mental health crisis. Like that isn't covered right now by accuracy rules. And as Brent points out, that's a concern.
Yeah, and just to add on to that answer, I mean, we're in a space too where you don't have to go through medical regulatory processes in order to get a product to market. You don't have to live up to these accuracy standards that say somebody like NICE would be enforcing, or basically public health institutions would be enforcing. And so that is an important question, especially when we're talking about any sort of potential trade-offs between the accuracy of the system and some other good that we're after, like transparency or fairness or whatever it may be. It's not to say that that's an inevitable trade-off you're going to have, but there's a relevant question there about what sort of trade-offs are we actually willing to make. Cynthia Rudin, for example, she's advocated for using interpretable models unless there's some hugely compelling reason why a small increase in accuracy would actually lead you to use black box models instead of interpretable ones. So I think we'll be having that conversation going forward.
Any views from the Commission side, perhaps?
We think accuracy is a very important element. I don't know the FDA legislation, but in the European Union for medical devices, we test, for example, the software, but we don't really test characteristics of the AI when that software is an AI. So the further we go into including AI into medical devices and in other products that are subject to safety legislation, we think it will be important that conformity assessments are also able to check for the performance of AI, and that performance does include accuracy. Now, how do we specify the levels of accuracy that we desire? That is a very complex question that will most probably have to be decided at the time of development of standards or at the time of the design of the procedures in the conformity assessment. It is not always a trade-off with transparency. You can still have accurate AI with sufficient level of transparency, and it can be facilitated, for example, by accompanying that AI with documentation. But we think that accuracy is important, and it's important also for all those remote biometric systems that we were also discussing earlier. Accuracy is extremely important.
Accuracy is very important. Thank you very much. We are running out of time, so we have like three minutes left. So I would like to ask the last questions to all my panelists. The same question, very easy question, and I will ask you to respond in less than 1 minute each, please. So what is the best path for AI, for trustworthy AI? The best path for the trustworthy AI. Janelle, can I start with you?
Yeah, I would lean toward data showing that we have done a bunch of these test decisions, and this is what we get. It's not a matter of taking anybody's word for it, but actually seeing what it does in the field, and also looking at different subsets of the population. If you have a medical device that is looking at pictures of skin to recognize cancer, and it does that great on light skin, but has not been trained sufficiently on dark skin and doesn't work for that, we should be looking at this kind of accuracy in these different subpopulations as well. So I think there's a lot of having people who can see some of these problems in advance, having a diverse group of people with power overseeing this, that's going to be really important.
Cecilia, please. Or Cecilia, over to you, the same question.
So that's not an easy one. The path for trustworthy, I would say the easy path is to start practicing with an assessment list, whether you are a government or you are an agency doing procurement, or you a company who is actually developing AI. That's at least a way to get started. And then I think for the longer term, I would say guideline on how to use our excellent framework already. So we speed up the application of AI, and then of course clear identification of these high-risk areas that we have heard from Janelle and from Brent today, and what are the gaps and how to address them. And lastly, not making sure that we are really collaborating closely with our international friends to design the right framework, so we don't have further fragmentation and closing down our good open markets. This will be that we take the leadership that Europe has, this kind of very high standard way of looking at things, and we should basically work with our account, with our friends globally to make sure that that we share opinions and that we share the frameworks as far as possible.
Thank you, Brent. Please.
Yeah, I suppose two things. One is that trustworthiness is very different than trust itself. It's relatively easy to get people to trust a technology, but to actually make that technology deserving of their trust is much harder. And we should definitely keep in mind that we're aiming for the latter, not the former. And that's where I start to think about, to do that, we need structured transparency. We need some common standards to make sure that we're overseeing these systems in a consistent way, where we can notice the problems as they happen rather than them just going unnoticed. Because the sorts of problems, the sorts of risks of AI, especially when we're talking about discrimination and fairness, can be very, very easy to miss if we're not looking in the right places. So transparency is great, but I'd like to see standards, common standards for auditing these systems going forward.
But not least, Commission, Lucilla.
for us, the best path to AI is to really being able to put in place a system that makes the European Union a place where trustworthy AI is developed and used as an international standard, and that we are able to put in place a system where we can actually check some of the main characteristics of artificial intelligence systems before they're put in the market, so that we can at least minimize the risk that artificial intelligence can bring.
Thank you so much. So I would like to thank all of you. I think we've had very interesting debate from different perspectives, different topics. I think you have managed to sum up and wrap up the debate. So I would just add that indeed what we need in the future is the transparency, trustworthy. We need standards. We need common allies. Also on the global stage, as Cecilia mentioned it, and it's also clear that we need the humans in control of the future. We forgot the humans in our discussion. Thank you very much, all of you, and looking forward to further discussion on this topic. I'm sure we will continue here in Brussels, but also on the other side of the Atlantic. Thank you all, and have a nice evening. Have a nice day. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Dita.
Thank you.